This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another EcoFoci seminar series. I'm Emily Lamonti. I'm co-lead of the seminar series with Deanna Krauser. And this seminar is part of NOAA's EcoFoci biannual seminar series focused on ecosystems of the North Pacific Ocean, Bering Sea, and U.S. Arctic to improve understanding of ecosystem dynamics and application of that understanding to management of living marine resources. And since 1986, this seminar has provided an opportunity for research scientists and practitioners to meet, present, and provoke conversation on subjects pertaining to physical and fisheries oceanography or regional issues in Alaska's marine ecosystems. You can visit the EcoFoci website for more information. And we sincerely thank you for joining us today as we have this hybrid meeting. So there's a great turnout in the room and online. Thanks to all of you from both audiences. And you can see our speaker lineup at the NOAA seminar series and on the NOAA PMEL calendar of events. And if you missed the seminar, they'll be posted on PMEL's YouTube page. It takes a few weeks to get these posted, but the seminars will be there eventually. And I ask that you keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. And during the talks, if you're online, please feel free to type your questions into the chat, and we'll be monitoring those and we'll address them all at the end of the talks. So today, I'm excited to introduce two speakers. We have Emily Hayden and Jens Nielsen, and these presentations will provide an overview of ocean temperature and sea ice variability, paired with a discussion of its potential impacts on phytoplankton bloom timing and zooplankton coming out of diapause in the Bering Sea. First, Emily Hayden is a graduate research fellow at Oregon State University in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, with a concentration in physics of oceans and atmospheres. Her research focuses on the link between atmospheric variability and the ocean state and the mechanisms that drive this coupling in the subpolar North Pacific.
All right, so can everyone hear me okay still?
Yeah, we can hear you, Emily. We can't see you.
Okay, would you like me to have my video on?
If you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, yes, please.
Okay, sure, I'll go ahead and turn that on. Okay, great. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my work looking at atmospheric circulation anomalies and their role in recent Bering Sea warming. So as requested, here's my and but therefore slide. So the Bering Sea has experienced exceptional oceanic and atmospheric climate extremes, particularly over the last decade or so 2010 onward. And the far-reaching environmental, social, and economic impacts are beginning to be well documented. However, the occurrence of these climate extremes is difficult to predict, largely because we don't fully understand underlying physical processes that drive them. Therefore, my research aims to develop our understanding of the air-sea dynamics responsible for Bering Sea climate extremes, which may be useful in the future for improving environmental predictive capability. Okay, there we go. So some of the recent coupled ocean atmospheric streams over the recent decade that are driving my research interests. These include extreme low sea ice extent, 2017, 2018 being the lowest on record, increased heat flux variability, elevated sea surface temperature. The upper figure on the right-hand side shows spatially average daily sea surface temperature anomalies from 1979 to 2021. And these are from the ERA5 reanalysis fields. And over the full record length, there's a warming trend of about 0.02 degrees C per year. And then if we look at the more recent years, so 2010 to 2021, this seems to have accelerated to about 0.1 degrees C per year. The lower figure on this slide shows the monthly mean mixed layer temperature anomalies. These are from the ECHO Ocean State Estimate. These are from 1992 to 2017. So this is a different climatological period, different grid scale than ERA5, but this is similarly suggestive of an increasing trend in mixed layer temperature anomalies. And some of these recent climate extremes are overlaid on top of decadal scale regime shifts. So increased sea ice extent variability, multi-year warm and cool episodes, as well as a possible system-wide regime shift that initiated in 2017. So I'm interested in the air-sea coupling in the Bering Sea and assessing the role of the atmosphere versus the role of the ocean in driving climate anomalies. So the air-sea heat fluxes describe the ocean-atmosphere coupling through the direct transfer of heat, and this can be used to assess whether observed air-sea heat flux anomalies are ocean-driven or atmosphere-driven processes. So just a brief review of air-sea heat fluxes before I go on. The net air-sea heat flux is made up of the turbulent exchange of heat, so the sensible and latent components, and the radiative exchange of heat, the shortwave and the longwave components. It's something to keep in mind throughout this talk when I refer to positive heat fluxes or positive heat flux anomalies. This is indicating into the ocean or warming fluxes, and negative heat fluxes or negative heat flux anomalies are indicating an out of the ocean or cooling flux. So our research objectives in this talk are as follows. We wanted to assess the role of the atmosphere in driving ocean temperature anomalies. We also wanted to analyze the role of atmospheric variability in driving the observed air-sea heat flux anomalies. And this work focuses on the recent decade, 2010 onward, primarily due to the climate extremes I listed previously. Okay. So some of these research questions remain open, at least in part, because as many of you know, the Bering Sea is a remote region with extreme weather conditions, particularly in the winter, and this has historically led to poor data coverage. In particular, there are minimal in situ measurements of surface heat fluxes, especially in the wintertime. So this work takes advantage of the rapidly expanding wealth of reanalysis products, ocean state estimates, etc., and these are used to gain insight into regional air-sea dynamics. So I'm going to be talking about two different data sources. The first is the NASA JPL Echo Ocean State Estimate, and I use the monthly model diagnostic output to compute a balanced mixed layer heat budget for the Bering Sea. And the second is the ECMWF reanalysis 5th generation, or ERA5 reanalysis fields. And I use daily averages of various oceanic and atmospheric variables to analyze the physical drivers of observed heat flux anomalies. So I started by computing a balanced heat budget using ECHO. So here we have the temperature tendency, so the time derivative of temperature over time in the mixed layer is described by a sum of vertical and horizontal advection, surface forcing by air-sea heat fluxes and freshwater fluxes, and horizontal and vertical diffusion. So we can take this heat budget, integrate it over a time-varying mixed layer depth, and then compute anomalies in each term of this balanced mixed layer heat budget relative to the 1992 to 2017 record length. So we assessed these anomalies using a balance metric, MB, developed by Halkides et al., to compare the importance of surface forcing to ocean dynamics, which we've defined as the sum of advection and diffusion of heat, and driving mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies. So when this metric is equal to 1, surface forcing anomalies drive the mixed layer temperature tendency variability. And when the metric is equal to -1, ocean dynamic anomalies drive the mixed layer temperature tendency variability. So on the figure on the left-hand side, this shows the balance metric for mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies during the sea ice. Oh, sorry, the upper figure, sorry. This is the balance metric for the mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies over all time, over all months, so 1992 to 2017. And the positive pinkish values are indicating the dominance of surface forcing anomalies in the mixed layer temperature tendency variability. So from this, we found that the surface forcing anomalies are driving around 70% of the total mixed layer temperature anomalies over this full data record. So the lower figure is also this balance metric for these anomalies of the mixed layer heat budget, but this is during the sea ice season that we've approximated as October through March. And we chose this because it's a period that has experienced many of these recently observed climate extremes I mentioned at the beginning. So again, the pink positive values are indicating the dominance of surface forcing anomalies and mixed layer temperature variability. We found that in this period, surface forcing anomalies account for approximately 65 to 80% of the mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies, depending on which month we're talking about. So from this, we So from this, we found that anomalies in surface forcing drive the majority of mixed air temperature tendency anomalies. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on the air-sea heat fluxes specifically because these are a dominant component of this surface forcing. So because we're interested in more recent events, so 2010 to present, and because ECHO is only available through 2017, we shifted to using the ERA5 daily atmospheric fields for the remainder of this analysis. And just two things to keep in mind is ERA5 is on a finer spatial and temporal grid than ECHO, and ERA5 is available over a longer time period. So we computed our climatology and therefore anomalies relative to a different base period of 1981 to 2010. So because of the previous result that surface forcing anomalies are dominating mixed air temperature anomalies in the ECHO heat budget, particularly during the cold season, we assessed the net air-sea heat flux anomalies in the Bering Sea during October through March. So the table shows, or the table describes the amount of anomalous heat entering the Bering Sea due to heat flux anomalies during each sea ice season, 2010 to 2021. And the key things to take away here are that the net heat flux anomalies drive over 2,000 exajoules excess heat into the Bering Sea over this time period. The turbulent component of the net flux, so the sensible plus the latent, accounts for 85% of the net heat anomaly. And furthermore, in the majority of the years that we considered, the sensible component was larger than the latent component. So this figure is a visual representation of what I just showed in the table. So this is the spatially averaged daily heat flux anomalies, the net, radiative, and turbulent during the sea ice season. This is just useful as a visual representation of the data table. And so this shows the dominance of the turbulent component of the heat flux anomaly in red and driving the net anomaly shown in black. And it also shows that there's a lot of year-to-year variability over the 12-year period that we analyzed. Okay. So because the turbulent anomalies drive the majority of the observed heat flux anomaly, we assess the dominant drivers of them. So first we look at the sensible heat flux. So we computed a decomposition of a bulk flux algorithm sensible heat flux anomaly, and that's shown in the upper right-hand side. So the climatologies throughout this are noted by overbars, and these are calculated over the 30-year period that I mentioned, 1981 to 2010. And anomalies are computed relative to the space period, and those are noted by primes. So this decomposition of the sensible heat flux is composed of three terms. So we have a term that is a function of the climatological wind speed, an anomalous air-sea temperature difference, a term that's a function of anomalous wind speed and the climatological air-sea temperature difference, and a third term that's a function of the anomalous wind speed and anomalies in the air-sea temperature difference. So this figure shows the spatially averaged daily sensible heat flux anomaly at the top, and then each term in the decomposition in the following panels. And the highlighted term in the equation that's also highlighted in the second panel of the figure, this is the term that's driven by the air-sea temperature difference anomalies, and this describes around 93% of the variance in the total sensible heat flux anomaly. So we further separated this term into the air temperature anomaly contribution and the sea surface temperature anomaly contribution, and that's shown in the new figure that's popped up. And from this, we can see that the air temperature anomaly term, which is the upper part of the upper panel, drives the vast majority of the sensible heat flux anomaly. Okay, so similar to the sensible heat flux decomposition I just talked about in the previous slide, we did something very similar with the latent heat flux anomaly and decompose this into three more or less analogous terms. So those terms are a function of wind magnitude and now the air-sea specific humidity difference. Again, overbars are climatologies, primes are anomalies. So this figure shows the spatially averaged daily latent heat flux anomalies at the top and each term in the decomposition. So the highlighted term in the equation and in the second panel in the figure is the air-sea specific humidity difference anomaly term. And this describes around 88% of the variance in the latent heat flux anomaly. So we again separated this term into the air-specific humidity anomaly term and the sea surface specific humidity anomaly term, and found again that the air-specific humidity anomalies are driving the majority of the latent heat flux anomaly. So from these decompositions of the sensible and latent heat flux anomalies, we can see that warm, moist air anomalies are driving the majority of the observed anomalous air-sea heat flux, and that this is driving ocean warming over the period of interest. Right. And then finally, because the turbulent heat fluxes are driven by these warm, moist air anomalies, we wanted to just look a little bit at the role of wind direction in driving those anomalies. So I'm only going to talk briefly about the sensible anomaly results here, but just keep in mind that we found a similar relationship between the wind direction and the latent heat flux as well. So the figure on the left-hand side shows the total sensible heat flux anomaly on the upper left, and then each decomposition component. And these have been bin averaged according to the wind direction. Excuse me. So when x equals minus pi, this is easterly wind, minus pi over 2 northerly wind, 0 westerly wind, and pi over 2 southerly wind. So if we start in the upper left-hand side, there is an approximately sinusoidal relationship between the wind direction theta and the total sensible heat flux anomaly. And when the wind is southerly, so pi over 2, we have the strongest positive sensible heat flux anomaly. We have similarly strong positive sensible heat flux anomalies with easterly wind as well. So if we move over to the second panel on the upper right, we found a similar result for the air-sea temperature difference term, which we found drove the majority of the sensible anomaly. And then for the other two terms, which are shown in the bottom panels, there's no clear relationship between these terms and the wind direction. So our proposed mechanism is that advection of warm air from the south and the east is leading to decreased ocean heat loss and increased positive sea surface temperature anomalies. So we're also interested in whether wind direction anomalies maybe were a dominant driver of these turbulent heat fluxes. And so we looked at a normalized histogram of wind direction theta. So the blue bars are the 1981 to 2010 wind angles, so the approximate climatology. The pink bars are the 2010 to 2021 wind angle, and the purple regions are the regions where they overlap. So over the recent period, there was a small increase in the southerly wind over the decadal scale of around 0.5%, and a small decrease in the northerly wind. But because there wasn't a very significant increase in the wind associated with the positive sensible heat flux anomalies, we want to look more at atmospheric advection to determine if the anomalously warm and humid air that's driving heat flux anomalies in the Bering Sea is being advected by like a climatologically average wind. Okay. So to summarize, atmospheric variability plays a key role in driving oceanic anomalies. From our mixed layer heat budget, we found that surface forcing anomalies drive the majority of the mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies in the Bering Sea over the ECHO data record length, 1992 to 2017. Using ERA5 heat fluxes, we found that during the sea ice season, 2010 to 2021, anomalies in the air-sea heat flux have generally been positive ocean warming fluxes that have contributed to a net increase of heat into the Bering Sea. These warming fluxes are dominated by the turbulent component of the net heat flux, particularly the sensible. And finally, atmospheric variability, particularly air temperature and specific humidity anomalies, are driving ocean warming anomalies. And therefore, a significant amount of the warming in the Bering Sea is driven by the atmosphere rather than simply intrinsic ocean processes. Okay, and some acknowledgements. And with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, and we're going to take questions for a panel with both our speakers. So right now, I'm going to introduce Jens Nielsen. He's an aquatic ecologist focusing primarily on phytoplankton ecology at NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. His research aims to understand community and trophic dynamics in ecosystems in an effort to develop biological indicators of ecosystem changes along the US West Coast from California to Alaska.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. I'm a research scientist at Seacoast, and I'm going to share a sort of a project in the very early phases, but where we're trying to understand a little bit about Calanus copepod diapause dynamics and how it relates to phytoplankton bloom timing. You see, we have a group of co-authors here. I work with Dave Kimmel, Lisa, and Wei Cheng on this project. But I also want to acknowledge all these names that are listed in the lower right, because they've been involved in a lot of the work that kind of connects into this project. Let's see if we can get, there we go. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the climate in the Eastern Bering Sea. Emily Hayden just did that very nicely. So I'm just going to show one figure here on the left where we see some sea surface temperatures, and that's just from satellite. And we've seen this before. We have some warm periods in the early 2000s, a cold period around 2010, 2012, and then this recent warm period. I'm curious how these warmer temperatures and reduction in sea ice influence the plankton, and particularly in this talk, how they influence the phenology. I'm going to focus on phytoplankton and zooplankton, and I'm going to look a little bit about how their connections are between them. So I put up this schematic, sort of starting to think a little bit about how phytoplankton and zooplankton are linked in time. The top part here is sort of maybe our starting point, our baseline, where we have a phytoplankton bloom in spring, and then we have consumers, the zooplankton in red, reacting to that phytoplankton and grazing and so on. So the question now with warming, that's my scenario 1 here, S1, does that mean that everything is shifting earlier, so that both the phytoplankton is shifting and then the zooplankton, but they're still kind of linked here in kind of a nice synchrony? Or are we seeing something where one stays sort of at the same time, so the phytoplankton bloom doesn't really shift, but the zooplankton does? And of course, there are many scenarios when you start thinking about predator-prey interactions. I just picked these two because I think they're relevant for what I'm going to talk about. Let's talk quickly about diapause, because I'm focusing on Calanus, and they have this very specific life cycle, we think. We don't know so much about the Bering. A lot of our information is from the Norwegians and Calanus Finnmarkicus. But if we look at this in sort of a simple framework, we have C5 stages that in late October, as a small bloom, usually they feed, and then they go into diapause. They go to the bottom and they lower their respiration rate. They just stay there dormant throughout the winter. The idea or the thinking is that they come up around the spring bloom, feed on the spring bloom. These C5 late stages become adults, and then they reproduce. So the question now with warming is, do we see a shift in this? Does the warming, because respiration rates are tightly coupled to temperature, does that mean that diapause exit? Basically, you run out of energy reserves and you have to get up early, and maybe you have to reproduce earlier, but you don't have a lot of food. So that's really the focus of this talk. Sort of a starting point, how long can these copepods, Calanus, physiologically stay in dormancy over the winter period? And then second, I'll start talking a little bit about how that links to the spring phytoplankton bloom. I'm going to start with the phytoplankton bloom because we do know quite a bit about the timing of that already. So here's a schematic that shows bloom timing. So the left figure, bloom timing on the left. We have all the years, 2003 to 2021. Green dots are estimates of bloom timing from the mooring at M2, and the black squares are estimates of those same bloom time from an area just around the mooring from satellite data. What we see here is interannual variability, but not a sort of clear directional change over time or with temperature. And the reason for that is probably already fairly well established, that we have this scenario where the bloom links closely to the ice retreat. So on the right figure, I have ice retreat on the bottom, bloom timing on the y-axis. All of this is day of year. And what we see is if we have ice sort of until mid-late March, the bloom basically happens as the ice retreats. So we follow this kind of dotted line. When we have ice retreat very early, the ice doesn't really influence the bloom timing. Instead, it's a combination of water stratification, relaxation of winds, and day length. But the bloom is not earlier. So we're not seeing sort of a very clear trend with warming. That's been shown in previous papers, and we see it here in this data that we've updated. we can look at that from space. So what I've done here is for a time period from 2003 to 2021, I estimated bloom timing from all these locations. And now each little circle is where I have bloom timing, and I've done a correlation relative to the sea surface temperature from satellites in that location. A star denotes that there's a significant trend with warming. So a red star would mean you have earlier bloom timing with warmer temperatures. And we really don't see a lot of change. There are some stars on the inner shelf and a little bit in the north where probably the link to ice retreat and thus warming influence bloom timing. But for most of the Bering Sea, we don't really see a lot of a shift directly to temperature with warming, or directly to temperature. So what about Calanus? Well, we know respiration rates couple tightly to temperature. And we also know as a consequence that the respiration you do during dormancy, it's very reduced, but it's still very tightly coupled to temperature. So I'm going to now use, I constructed a simple model trying to calculate the Calanus diapause, and it's really a metric of how long can you diapause. And you take into account animal size, you make some assumptions and some understanding about the lipid storage, because that's basically what they're slowly feeding on during the winter period, and how fast that goes, so the respiration rate. I'm using an existing framework for this. I'm gonna, for this talk, assume that we basically gonna release my diapause copepod on the 1st of October of prior year. And what we also assume is if they can diapause long enough, they will somehow find out to get to the surface when the spring bloom happens. I'm gonna use temperature from the Bering Sea RAMS model, so the 10K bottom temperature. And down here is just a nice picture of what a copepod looks right before it goes into diapause. A lot of lipids that it can slowly respire. So directly to some results, modeling. So basically the color scale is how long can you diapause? And we have a cold year on the left, 2011. We have a warm year on the right, 2019. And these numbers refer to the day of year. I put in the dates sort of matching that. We obviously see here that this is a model that's fed temperature, so temperature has a huge effect on the extent you can diapause. We see a very big difference between how long you can diapause, particularly in sort of the middle shelf, whether it's a warm or cold year. Now the next thing is trying to link this a little bit to the bloom timing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the same spatial projections or predictions of diapause extent, how long can you diapause? I'm going to link it to bloom timing estimates from the satellite. And I'm just using 1 year here as an example, but I've done this for all the years. And I'm going to look at the difference in days. So basically that's the figure on the right. Colors here, so if you're in the red color, that basically means a negative value means diapause ended before the bloom timing. So you had to come out of diapause, go to the surface, but there was not a bloom yet. Blue means you were able to diapause at least to the bloom or even later. So we can look at that a little bit differently. It's the same type of scale with negative values. So if we look on the left side of the figure here, the left side will be a diapause exit prior to the spring bloom. The zooplankton have to sort of come up prior to the bloom. Or if you can diapause, so the blue colors on the right side of this dotted line, you can diapause at least until the spring bloom. So if we look at the density distribution, and I've split this into cold periods, so 2010 and 12, I've split it into North Bering Sea and South Bering Sea. And what we see here is in the North Bering Sea in a cold year, basically everywhere you were, except for a small little tail, everywhere you are, you're able to diapause to the bloom, according to this model framework. If we go to the next slide, so now I have same figure and same scale, negative values, early exit from diapause. The two left figures are the North Bering Sea, and the blue is the cold period, and then we have red is for the late warm years here, 2018, 2020. So we see a clear shift, a We're starting to see even in the north, there are going to be areas where it does not appear you can diapause long enough to reach the spring bloom. In the south, we see the same thing in the warm period. So lower right, we see almost everywhere in the south, it seems like you have to exit diapause before the spring bloom. In the cold period, there are even areas where you still exit early, but there's a lot larger proportion that are able to diapause until the spring bloom. I've taken a very first stab at this and looking at the actual survey data because it's good to look at what's actually measured. And what we see, so what's plotted here is the different colors. And I'm very sorry, I lost the scale here, but these are different. The adults are the red. We have C3, so younger stages, and C4. C3 is green, C4 is the blue. And then the purple are these C5 stages that are overwintering and then coming up. And what's plotted on these bars, so what says 40 to 60, 60 to 80, there's a time of emergence. So we have early emergence on the left side of this panel. And what we see is when we've calculated for a given location and year, if we've calculated early emergence according to the model, we also see a lot more of the actual C5 stages. So they're coming up early. There's a lot to think about when you look at survey data and development of copepods and generally also the timing of the survey. But it's the first cut that kind of shows what we would expect. We see them earlier if there's early emergence. So what does that mean? First of all, it's pretty clear that when we have these warm years, diapause time is substantially shorter in warm years than in cold years. And it seems that to occur more frequently that diapause has to finish before you reach the bloom in spring. So what's the implications? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as you come up before the bloom, you die. It's been observed before that these copepods, they have early emergence. What it might suggest and what we're sort of discussing is that what's happening here is sort of an environmental filtering for different life strategies, that in some years there are going to be more copepods that just stay dormant until the spring bloom, and that's a good strategy when it's cold. Whereas in warmer years, it's a completely different strategy of getting up early. With this whole warming of the system, are we starting to see some big shifts both temporally, so more years where we're going to have life strategies of very early emergence, and also spatially, are we going to start seeing that further north? Why is that important? Well, part of this relates to, we see these C5 stages coming up earlier. Warmer temperatures also mean faster development times. So starting to talk about whether it is possible to have 2 generations per season. Bering Sea system is kind of on the border for these species to do that. So rather than having 1 generation, you have 2 generations. That could have quite some implications for the food web, particularly in late summer, where smaller fish feed on these large C5 stages. If they are not there anymore because they've started reproducing, and thus we have much smaller stages in the 2nd generation scenario, maybe there's less food. One of the challenges with doing this type of modeling is that we actually have 2 species here that mix and are hard to distinguish. So that's another area to look into, probably using genetics. What are we dealing with, and are there any shifts between these two species? So I don't have much more at this point. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you again. Now we have an opportunity to take questions for both speakers. I have some questions in the chat. If you guys want to share your webcams, and you can stop sharing your screen, or you can leave that up again.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how I do that because my window got very small.
All right, I have 2 questions. I have 2 questions in the chat. I'm going to start with those. One is from James Overland, a question for Emily. Can you comment on upstream air mass changes rather than southerly wind changes?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's sort of suggestive of what we're wanting to look at in the future. So we still need to do a robust assessment of advection of anomalies, but we've seen some event scale cases of elevated temperatures, ocean temperatures, and decreased sea ice that are associated with anomalously warm, anomalously warm and wet air north and northwest of the Bering Sea. Also, there have been things like the 2022 Siberian winter heat wave and other Arctic and north of the Bering Sea winter air temperature anomaly events. And these anomalies may be advected over the Bering Sea. So we're really interested in air mass changes both north and south of the Bering Sea region, partly because there's seasonal variability in the wind direction. Yeah, overall though, where the kind of early look that we've done is suggestive that these northern air mass changes are important for driving some of these turbulent heat flux anomalies, but that's still something we're looking at.
Thank you. And there's a question for Jens. Can you please talk about how you obtained the diapause duration data and how it was measured?
Yeah, so that's using, and I'm happy to share that with, I think Cody is the one asking. I'm happy to share that. It's basically a lot of empirical data, and it is based on Calamus pneumococus. We look at respiration rates to temperature. There's measurements of the size of the animal and how much wax esters, storage lipids they have, and then we make some assumption. We put that into the model and calculate how we can diapause. But it's some long, fancy equations. I'm happy to share that and talk more about that, Cody.
We have a question in the chat, but first I'm going to take one from the room. Al?
Yeah, question for Emily. Do you happen to know, was the ECHO reanalysis driven by the ERA products for its atmospheric forcing?
Yeah, it was driven with the ERA interim products, so they're going to be slightly different. So they're driven with that, and then they output a modified version from the adjoint model that ECHO uses.
Okay, thanks.
And another comment from the chat, both great talks, thanks for presenting. The question for Emily, how does sea ice play a role in the heat balance, or is your heat budget analysis only over ice-free area?
That's a really great question. So for our mixed layer heat budget, we did this over the full region, so including the sea ice areas. The MIT GCM that ECHO uses does include a sea ice model within that. So sea ice in a way is accounted for. We're still looking more at how sea ice variability affects the heat balance. But yeah, sea ice is included in the model and so is part of our heat budget.
Wait.
Yeah, Emily, thanks very much for the talk. Really nice. I was wondering, all your results is averaged over the whole Bering Sea, right?
So the heat budget results are going to be over the whole Bering Sea, but the results using ERA 5, at this point, we're doing only the ice-free area. And the reason for doing that is that there are issues with ERA 5 over sea ice. And so for now, we're just looking at ice-free area and trying to consider how we can incorporate the sea ice covered regions in the future.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I think maybe northern versus southern Bering Sea may have certain nuances that this kind of analysis wouldn't be able to catch. Another, maybe just a comment, but I don't know if I'm totally right here. Phyllis is in the room as well. This is a very shallow and wide shelf. So in some ways, it's not surprising the atmospheric forcing dominates the variability. But if you zoom in to certain regions of the Bering Sea, such as those close to the Aleutian Island chain, maybe And if you build in delays in your analysis, maybe you will be able to see certain ocean influences more so than just atmospheric forcing. By that I mean maybe there's warm water coming in from the Gulf, which preconditions the ocean, and then the surface forcing anomaly came along. So there's the responses may still be somewhat different. Anyway, yeah, thanks very nice thank you for a nice talk.
Thank you for that comment. That's something that we're talking about a lot, is how we can look at this heat budget in more detail and what the appropriate spatial scales and how to, divide the Bering Sea, because even just looking at the heat budget and looking at the shelf versus the basin, there are, different seasonal patterns and different things that drive those. We did find though that on the shelf and in the deep basin that the surface forcing anomalies are driving the majority of the mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies, but we do plan to look more detail at more detail of the ocean dynamics. Thanks for that comment.
Are there any other questions from online? Jiaxu?
Hi, Emily. This is Jiaxu, and thanks very much for the interesting talk. I have a comment for the data that you're using. So I noticed that you're using the ECHO model. It's a global model. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So I think the ECHO also have a Arctic regional version, which is available starting last year probably. And the lead author is Anne Engwine from Texas A&M University. So I think that model have much higher resolution in the Arctic. I'm not sure how much of the Bering Sea has been included in the model, but I think most of Bering Sea is included, and they have a huge data simulation of the observations in the model. So and it's also the ocean model is still MIT GCM, and I think they also have their ice model, but I'm not very much sure about that. So maybe that's something that you can check with. Yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you so much for that recommendation. I've heard a little bit about the Arctic regional version, but I'll look into it in more detail. Thanks.
I have a question for Jens. Can you comment, so you focused on Calanus, can you comment on the likely impact of this phenology on other species? Is this a pattern that might be significant across the ecosystem more broadly, or is this one of the core indicators that you're looking into for being able to look at this mixed match between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton?
Some of the zooplankton, and I think Dave should probably chime in as well, but they have quite different life strategies or ways of doing the seasonal cycle. Like for example, Sotocalanus, I don't think do any diapausing. They just kind of keep cycling through reproductions. And I don't know so much about Neocalanus. So I think this particular calculation is probably specific to Calanus, but I'm looking around to see if I can get some help from Dave.
Dave is in the room, so we're.
I'm not.
Oh, that's why I don't see him. There you go, Dave.
Yeah, so Neocalanus species would be the other, and they have a different diapause strategy. They, instead of coming up in the spring to use the bloom to reproduce, they use the bloom to put on lipids, and they enter into diapause after the bloom. So any sort of warming, and they're typically deeper basin species, so any sort of warming would impact them as well. But since they're not on the shelf, the warming might not be as big a deal for them because they diapause at much deeper depths. So Calanus is sort of the one we focus on because it's so important to the food web in terms of transferring lipids to commercial fish and other species. So.
Okay. All the way, you both shot at the same time. Al?
Yeah, just a comment relating to both talks. A point of interest in our modeling studies, we found a strong covariance amongst air temperature and bottom temperature on the Bering Sea shelf and fall zooplankton. In this case, less fall zooplankton when it's warmer. But that has shown up consistently over the years as a strong covariance amongst those three and others.
But
Yeah, Jens, thanks for the talk. Maybe this is just a comment. So what struck me on your slide is those the differences in your PDF figure. There's a very big difference between the northern versus southern Bering Sea, how they respond to the warming. So I wondered whether this is only because of environmental factors, say temperature in north versus south are different, or it has certain biological kind of characteristics, different species of the zooplankton or whatever. But that figure is very striking to me, how the north and south are very different responding to warming. I wonder, you guys have plans to do more analysis on that.
Didn't expect to be questioned by my co-author, but no. No, I think the whole, it is very interesting. I keep having this both in this bloom timing paper and here is, I keep having to want to split because you start seeing these different patterns. I think, the diapause, if that's the figure you're thinking about, the diapause modeling is very much temperature driven. So it might be that it's still, maybe except for parts in 1819, the North Bering Sea is still just cold enough that, it remained fairly cold. I'm trying to remember the cold pool formation plots, because that is, it's pretty tightly coupled to the diapause extent, right? So I don't know if that fully answers it, but I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say 2018 didn't have a cold pool. 2019 did have a cold pool, not very extensive, but it was just that bit colder than 18. And so, but there was a cold pool in the north.
So if you remember my seminar in the spring, which I know we all took a lot of notes and remember that closely, basically the North Bering Sea doesn't respond very strongly until that threshold of ice is reached, and then the communities respond quite strongly. So really that cold pool is acting to keep the bottom temperatures low and keep those copepods in diapause. And then even when they come up, you basically don't see, you see that even distribution of stages only until it gets super warm. Then the development rates crank up and the whole community responds. So it looks like the southern Bering Sea was having this variability all along, but the northern Bering Sea was insulated because of the ice and the cold pool. Once you remove that threshold, then you get a pretty strong zooplankton response out of the community to warming. So NEP should make a decision on that paper that I have in revision, hopefully any minute.
So did you have data from 18 also?
Yeah, we had data from 18, and that basically was the point at which the northern Bering Sea really showed a community response. Before that, there wasn't much going on, even when it got really warm. So the 2003 to 5 period was different from the recent low ice period.
Yeah. The other problem is no ice, you weaken stratification by 50%. Now you heat the bottom layer extensively. And so there's a combination of things.
And the result was really a lot of meroplankton and neritic plankton went out onto the shelf. And so you saw a really small dominant copepod community that was not seen in the northern Bering Sea prior to that point.
So I have a question for Jens and Dave. You got your crystal balls. So let's suppose we're down in the future and Calanus can't make it anymore in the Bering Sea. What zooplankton would likely take over of them?
Calanus. Different species.
Just species.
Yeah, I mean, So Calanus is basically a genus that goes from the Arctic all the way down to the subtropics. And a different genus will come in. Pacificus is a very similar species. Marshallay is very similar. Pacificus is much smaller, not a big lipid bearer. Marshallay is somewhat in between, and then the glacialis haplotypes are generally much more ice associated with lipid. We don't know genetically what the landscape is looking like. I'm writing a proposal with Anne Tarrant to look at that right now. We don't know who's actually there. So that's one of the problems in predicting what's going to happen is who's going to replace it. If it's Pacificus, it's going to be it's a borealized system essentially, where lipid storage is no longer a feature of the plankton community there, because there's probably going to be year-round productivity enough to have continuously reproducing populations versus the pulse productivity of blooms. Though those are prominent features in temperate systems as well. So just depends how warm it gets.
So part B of that question then is that with different species of Calanus coming in, does that change the ability of small fish to eat?
So in the spring, probably not. I think there's lots of larval fish feeding capability on Nauplii and other things. But later in the year, if you're a fish and you're trying to pack on lipids to overwinter, you could be in trouble, because basically what we see is what Al said. When you get large warm temperatures, the zooplankton drop later in the year. And that's really when the fish are large enough, and a lot of them feed very, very strongly on Calanus in the Bering to get enough energetic content to overwinter and recruit to the population.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the present version of the NPZ model, we're running diapause is more fixed. It sounds like there's enough information to confidently make that temperature dependent. That a fair statement that we could confidently do that now?
Yeah, I think it's a fair statement. I mean, there's plenty of work done in Finmarchicus stating that the lipid accumulation window hypothesis, that basically diapause is determined by lipid content, is widely supported, though there are others who say that it's light related or temperature related. So, but I think it's lipid related. I think if you increase the respiration rate to the point where they run out of lipids, they're out of options. They got to come out of diapause. So I would say that you could model that in a temperature dependent relationship. You would also need, though, the lipid information, which we're working on gathering more information on that with the help of Cody Pinger and Rob Surian up in Rica. We're starting to establish a data set that has lipid amounts that we could potentially relate to diapause durations.
Would a sensible way of doing that be to use like degree days?
So that's been an approach that's been used, degree days, but in general, the model that Jens has worked on, the Somweber and Durbin model, has been the one that's been adopted in the Atlantic to explain Finmarchicus variability. The other thing is, it seems to be that these copepods have a wide portfolio of who's going in and out of diapause. In other words, each individual, there's a lot of individual variability and when they enter and exit diapause, and that's thought to be like a portfolio strategy. In other words, if a significant portion of the population is entering and exiting diapause at varying times, somebody will hit and the population will continue to recruit. So there's been individual-based models, even evolutionary-based models to work on this diapause question in the Atlantic. We're just way far behind. But the answer is yes, you can certainly model it in a temperature-dependent relationship with some size and lipid estimate information. And Jens has done that. So.
I have another question for Emily. If you've looked at areas where there is and isn't sea ice coverage under the same atmospheric conditions, and is there any difference in the heat budget in those cases as a way to tease out the impact of sea ice? And I also wonder, it sounds like the phytoplankton are driven more by sea ice, Jens, and I was curious, is there any projection and shifts in timing of the phytoplankton, or is the projection that phenology is more fixed relative to the diapods.
So my sound cut out a little bit. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask if, I think the first question was to Emily. I had sound cut out. I heard the second part.
Oh, sorry.
Ready to go first.
Yeah. Emily, I was wondering if you've done any analysis of the heat budget with and without sea ice to try to tease out the impact.
We've done a little bit of that. We primarily just looked at the heat budget without sea ice and kind of looked at what term in the surface forcing is most important. And it looks like we can see the signature of the turbulent heat flux anomalies being very, very important in driving mixed layer temperature tendency anomalies when we don't look at the sea ice as well. But we need to look at that in a little bit more detail because at this point it's mostly just been looking at the mixed layer heat budget over the full region, and we need to think a little bit more about how to separate the effects of ice.
And then I think you asked about the bloom dynamics, right?
Yeah.
So
ice versus temperature in the
yeah, I mean, in the Bering Sea, and maybe there's a bit of a southern Bering Sea lens. You know, you have kind of this, once ice is not there past mid-March, it becomes winds and stratification that kind of drives it. And you need enough light, which is, you can think about day length. So the bloom's not going to keep switching earlier and earlier there. If you look further north, so in the Chukchi and even in the Arctic, there are papers that have come out recently, really nice papers that have shown kind of how that bloom is still so correlated to the ice retreat that as ice retreat comes earlier, you also tend to have earlier blooms. And I think WEI have shown similar things in their model projections, if I remember correctly. But in the Bering, there is kind of this early, you're not going to keep going earlier and earlier. I think usually what they've seen at M2, for example, is when you don't have sea ice, the bloom's almost a few weeks later. But that is also dependent on spring storms. You need those storms to kind of not happen for a little while so you can set up some kind of stratification. Does that answer it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I wonder if the storms and the atmospheric heat are related too. But we have just time for one question. We're getting up on time, but if someone wants to jump in, otherwise we can thank our speakers. Thank you for the discussion and for your presentations, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks.